What if I told you that the most daring, most audacious raid of the entire Second World War wasn't carried out by a squad of elite spies or by a fleet of bombers, but by a single, rusty, obsolete American destroyer packed to the gills with high explosives? A ship they planned to sail directly into the heart of enemy territory and deliberately ram into a German dock, detonating in what would become the largest non-nuclear explosion of the war. It sounds like something from a movie, a last-ditch suicidal mission born of desperation. But it wasn't a movie, it was real. And the story behind why they had to do it is even more incredible. To understand this raid, you have to understand the problem. In 1942, the British Admiralty had a problem, a massive 50,000-ton problem named Tirpitz. The Tirpitz was the sister ship to the Bismarck, the largest battleship ever built by Germany. She was a floating fortress, a terrifying symbol of Nazi naval power, and for 2 years she didn't really have to do anything. Her mere existence, hiding in the Norwegian fjords, was a strategic nightmare for the Allies. You see, the Tirpitz, if she chose to, could sail out into the North Atlantic and single-handedly decimate the vital Arctic convoys. These were the supply ships ploughing through treacherous icy waters, delivering tanks, planes and food to the Soviet Union, who were fighting for their lives on the Eastern Front. If the Tirpitz sank those convoys, the Soviet war effort could collapse. The entire Allied alliance could unravel. The Royal Navy threw everything they had at this problem. They tried bombing her. They tried mining the fjord she was hiding in. They even tried a daring mini-submarine attack. But the Tirpitz was a ghost, protected by nets, anti-aircraft fire, and the sheer geography of the Norwegian coast. She was damaged, but she was never taken out of the fight. And as long as she was a threat, the Royal Navy had to keep their own battleships, like the HMS Duke of York, tied up in northern Scotland, just in case she made a move. It was a massive drain of resources at a critical time in the war. So, British intelligence started asking a different question. Forget sinking the Tirpitz at sea. What if she gets damaged? Where would she go for repairs? Our intelligence analysts, poring over maps and reconnaissance photos, found the answer. There was only one dry dock on the entire European coast controlled by the Germans that was large enough to hold a ship the size of the Tirpitz. It was the Normandie Dock at the French port of Saint-Nazaire. It was a massive, imposing structure, originally built by the French to house the legendary liner SS Normandie. It was the Tirpitz's only lifeline. If they could destroy the Normandie Dock, they would neutralize the Tirpitz for good without ever having to sink her. It was a brilliant strategic insight. The only problem was that Saint-Nazaire was one of the most heavily fortified places on Earth. This wasn't just a port, it was a fortress. It was the main base for the German U-boat fleet, the very wolves that were sinking Allied shipping in the Atlantic. The entrance to the estuary leading to the port was protected by massive naval guns. The port itself was ringed by anti-aircraft emplacements, searchlights, and thousands of German soldiers. The U-boat pens, built of reinforced concrete, were said to be indestructible. Attacking Saint-Nazaire from the sea was considered a suicide mission. Attacking from the air was just as bad. The German flak was so thick, the RAF called the place Flak City. A conventional bombing raid would never get close enough to destroy the dock's massive gates with any precision. They needed a different kind of weapon. A guided weapon, one that could navigate the river's winding channels and deliver its payload with pinpoint accuracy. So, what was the plan? It was audacious. It was borderline suicidal. And in its own brutal way, it was brilliantly simple. They were going to take a ship, pack it with explosives, and sail it right up to the dock gates and ram it. For this, they needed a ship that wouldn't be missed, something the Germans wouldn't recognize as a major threat. They found the perfect candidate in the USS Buchanan, an old American destroyer from the First World War that had been lent to the British as part of the Lend-Lease program. The Royal Navy renamed her HMS Campbelltown. She was old, she was slow, and she looked tired. They stripped her down, painted her to look like a German destroyer, and then they began the real work. Inside her hull, behind a false bulkhead, naval demolition experts packed over 4 tons of amatol, a powerful military explosive. They had effectively turned the old American destroyer into a massive, guided torpedo, 300 feet long, but the ship was only half the plan. The Campbelltown's job was to breach the dock. The other half of the mission was to cause as much chaos as possible and destroy the key infrastructure of the port itself. For that, they needed men. Not sailors, but butchers. They turned to the British commandos, elite raiding forces trained for this exact kind of high-stakes, close-quarters combat. The mission was codenamed Operation Chariot, and the man chosen to lead the commando assault was Lord Lovat, a charismatic Scottish aristocrat known for leading his men into battle while his personal piper played the bagpipes. His commandos, along with a small contingent of Royal Engineers, were tasked with landing, destroying the pumping machinery that operated the dock, and taking out as many of the German gun positions as they could. It was a 2-pronged attack, a ship-sized bomb and a human-scale wave of destruction. The stage was set. The rusty old American destroyer and its human cargo of demolition experts and commandos were gathered in Falmouth, England. Their target was the most heavily defended location in occupied Europe. The question wasn't if they would take casualties. The question was if a single one of them would even make it ashore. So how do you sail a 300-foot bomb into one of the most heavily defended ports in the world without getting blown out of the water before you even get close? The answer was a combination of breathtaking audacity, meticulous planning, and a very big gamble. On the evening of March 26, 1942, a flotilla of 2 destroyers, 1 motor launch, and 16 small motor launches set sail from Falmouth, England. At the heart of this small fleet was the HMS Campbelltown. The audacity of the plan was matched only by its simplicity. They were going to sail right up to the front door, pretending to belong there. They binged on a single, fragile assumption, that in the darkness and confusion of a night approach, the German lookouts wouldn't look too closely. To help with this deception, the Campbelltown was painted a dark grey and modified to resemble a German Moe-class destroyer. They even flew a German Kriegsmarine ensign from the mast. The journey up the French coast was tense. They had to avoid German patrol boats and aircraft. As they neared the mouth of the Loire estuary, the mood on board grew grim. This was it. There was no turning back. On March 27th, they turned into the Loire. The river was narrow, winding and treacherous. The banks were lined with German positions. They were sailing into a trap, and they knew it. Commander Robert Beatty, the Campbelltown's captain, was on the bridge, his eyes glued to the darkness ahead. The ship crept forward at a slow, steady 12 knots, its engines muffled to reduce noise. The plan was to use the cover of darkness and a heavy cloud bank to slip past the outer defences. The clouds began to break, and the moon came out. Suddenly they were exposed, silhouetted against the water. The tension became unbearable. Every man on board was waiting for the flash of a German gun, the telltale wake of a torpedo. Then, it happened. A German signal lamp on the shore began blinking a message at them. The moment of truth. A British signalman, using a captured German codebook, began to reply, stalling for time, giving nonsensical answers to the Germans' questions. The ruse was working, but it couldn't last forever. On March 28th, with the dock gates just a few hundred yards away, the game was up. A single, brilliant searchlight beam snapped on, spearing the Campbelltown in its harsh white light. It was followed by another and another. In that moment, they went from infiltrators to targets. A German loudspeaker blared out a challenge, and when no satisfactory answer was given, all hell broke loose. The alarm bells of Saint-Nazaire screamed into the night, and every German gun in the estuary opened fire. Water around the Campbelltown erupted in columns of white spray as shells and bullets slammed into her hull. Beatty ordered the engines to full throttle. The old American destroyer, which had been masquerading as a German vessel, now tore forward, her battle flags, the white ensign of the Royal Navy, run up the mast. The German guns on the Old Mole, a large jetty, were firing at point-blank range. Men on the decks were cut down where they stood. The bridge of the Campbelltown was shattered, killing everyone inside except Beatty and one other officer. But the ship kept going. She was a mortally wounded animal, but she had one last deadly charge left in her. Decks of the Campbelltown and in the small motor launches that had followed her in, the commandos and Royal Engineers were ready. As the ship crashed through the defensive boom protecting the inner harbour, they were battered by the waves and the deafening gunfire. Their job was to get ashore and destroy the port's infrastructure. The Campbelltown's job was to deliver her payload. Commander Beatty, wounded and bleeding, kept his eyes on the target. The massive steel gates of the Normandie Dock loomed ahead. "Stand by to ram," he yelled over the din. At 1:34 a.m, the HMS Campbelltown, travelling at nearly 20 knots, hit the dock gates. The impact was not a clean explosion, but a deep, metallic, grinding groan as the old ship's bow crumpled and tore through the steel gates, driving her body 36 feet into the dock structure. She was lodged exactly where she was supposed to be. The bomb was in place. But the mission was far from over. The demolition charges on board were set with a timed fuse. The commandos had a specific amount of time to get in, destroy their targets, and get out before the entire dock went up. As the German soldiers on the quayside recovered from their shock and began to organise a defence, the commandos swarmed off the Campbelltown and from their landing craft. They were met with a wall of machine gun fire. Lord Lovat, in the thick of the fighting, urged his men on, and in one of the most surreal and courageous moments of the entire war, Lovat's personal piper, 21-year-old Bill Millin, ignoring the bullets zipping past his head, walked the deck of the Campbelltown and then out onto the quayside, playing his bagpipes. The sound of the road to the Isles echoed across the chaos of the battle, a defiant, almost insane act of courage that both inspired the British and utterly bewildered the Germans. The bomb was in place, but the men who delivered it were now trapped in the heart of the fortress, with no way out but through the German army. With the HMS Campbelltown wedged firmly in the Normandie Dock gates, the first phase of Operation Chariot was complete. But the mission had now entered its most brutal and chaotic phase. The commandos were ashore, but they were not in a secure position. They were in the belly of the beast, and the beast was waking up. The sound of Bill Millin's bagpipes, a moment of pure, otherworldly courage, had given the British a crucial few seconds of advantage. The German defenders, for a moment, were so stunned by the sheer audacity of a man playing bagpipes under fire that their response was delayed. But that shock was rapidly turning to rage. The German garrison, 1,000 strong, was now fully alert and pouring into the dock area, determined to annihilate the raiders. So, what exactly were these commandos supposed to do? Their mission wasn't just to cause random mayhem. They were a surgical strike team with a very specific, two-pronged objective, and they were working against a very unforgiving clock. The first objective was to destroy the pumping and winding machinery of the Normandie Dock itself. The Campbelltown's bomb would destroy the gates, but if the Germans could repair the pumps and motors, they could drain the dock and get it back in operation within weeks. The commandos had to make sure the damage was permanent. The second objective was to destroy as much of the port's other infrastructure as possible: the U-boat pens, the fuel depots, the lock gates, anything that would cripple the German U-boat threat and create as much economic damage as possible. The commando teams split up, moving with a disciplined urgency that was the hallmark of their training. One team, led by Lieutenant William Hairy Boyd, made a mad dash for the pumping house. It was a fortified building, bristling with machine guns, but they had to get inside. Under covering fire from their comrades, they stormed the building, lobbing grenades through the windows and clearing it room by room. Once inside, the Royal Engineers in the team got to work. They didn't just plant a few charges, they placed their explosives with meticulous precision, ensuring that the massive pumps and turbines would be shattered beyond all repair. As they finished setting the last charge, Boyd and his team could hear the sounds of heavy German troops approaching. Their escape route was already being cut off. Meanwhile, another team was assaulting the winding house, the building that controlled the massive caisson gates of the dry dock. This was even more heavily defended, situated on a raised position with a clear field of fire. The commandos had to cross an open quay, exposed to intense machine gun fire from the old mole. Men fell all around them, but they kept moving. A corporal named Thomas, seeing his comrades cut down, single-handedly charged the German machine gun nest, taking it out with a well-aimed grenade and his submachine gun. His action allowed the remaining engineers to breach the winding house. Inside, they found a scene of industrial chaos of a different kind. They placed their charges on the huge electric motors and giant gears that operated the dock, turning a piece of industrial machinery into a bomb. All across the dock, small, fierce battles were raging. Commando teams were blowing up the fuel tanks, sending huge plumes of black smoke and fire into the night sky. Others were targeting the U-boat pens, though the thick concrete resisted their best efforts. The Germans were now fully organised. They were bringing up heavy weapons, setting up roadblocks, and their superior numbers began to tell. The British raiders were masters of the swift, violent raid, but they couldn't hold territory. They were not there to occupy St. Nazaire, they were there to break it. And now, with their primary objectives completed, they had to get out. But how? The original plan was for the commandos to be evacuated by the small motor launches that had accompanied the Campbelltown. These fast, agile boats were supposed to pick them up at designated points along the quayside and then race back out of the estuary before the Germans could fully react. But the plan was unravelling. The German fire was so intense that many of the motor launches were destroyed or crippled before they could even reach the extraction points. The ones that did make it found themselves under a hail of fire, trying to load wounded and exhausted men under impossible conditions. The quayside, which was supposed to be their escape route, had become a killing zone. The clock was not just ticking, it was screaming. The demolition charges on the Campbelltown were set to detonate at 4:30 a.m. It was now past 3:00 a.m. The commandos who had completed their missions found themselves scattered, surrounded, and with dwindling ammunition. The Germans were closing in from all sides, methodically clearing the dock area building by building. The raid was turning into a disaster. The commandos had achieved the impossible. They had breached the most heavily defended port in Europe and planted their bombs. But they were now trapped, with no way out. They had fought their way into a fortress, and now they had to fight their way back out, or die trying. The Germans were tightening the noose, and out in the river, the wounded Campbelltown sat silently, a ticking time bomb, waiting to unleash its final, terrible judgment on the port of St. Nazaire. By 3:30 a.m., the mission had devolved into a desperate, bloody scramble for survival. The commandos had done their jobs with brutal efficiency. The pumps were destroyed, the winding house was a wreck, and the fuel depots were burning. But they were now trapped in a collapsing perimeter, with the German army squeezing the life out of their raiding force. The evacuation plan, which had seemed so simple on paper, had disintegrated in the face of overwhelming firepower. The motor launches, which were supposed to be their lifeline, were being systematically hunted and destroyed in the river. Many commandos found themselves with no choice but to try and fight their way out of the town on foot. A hopeless prospect in a foreign country filled with enemy soldiers. On the quayside, the scene was utter carnage. The remaining motor launches that could make it to the docks attempted to pick up as many men as they could, their decks slick with blood and oil. German machine guns raked their hulls, and mortar shells rained down around them. One launch, ML-306, managed to take on over 50 survivors, many of them wounded, before it was hit and set ablaze. The men on board were forced to jump into the freezing water of the Loire, only to be shot as they swam. Another launch, ML-177, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Tugwin, made a daring run, rescuing a handful of men before its engines were disabled, and it drifted helplessly downriver. Wynne and his crew continued to fight, using their small arms against the German positions on the shore until their ammunition ran out. In the end, there was no organised withdrawal. There was only individual survival. Some small groups of commandos managed to link up and fight their way through the streets, trying to reach the southern edge of the town, where they hoped to find a way to escape into the French countryside. Others, surrounded and out of ammunition, were forced to surrender. But for many, there would be no surrender. They would fight to the last bullet. The human cost was staggering. Of the 611 men who had set sail from England, only 228 would make it back. The rest were either killed or captured, Almost every single man who set foot on French soil was either killed or wounded. The raid had been a tactical success, but it had come at a devastating price. And all the while, the Humps, Campbelltown, sat wedged in the dock gates, a silent, wounded giant. The Germans, having secured the dock, swarmed over the ship. They were puzzled. Why had the British rammed an old, obsolete destroyer? It didn't make sense. Some German officers, including a group of naval engineers who had come to inspect the damage, even walked casually along the deck of the Campbelltown, peering into its battered hull. They saw the mangled bodies of British sailors and the destroyed guns, but they didn't see the 4 tons of Amatol hidden deep inside the ship, behind the false bulkhead. The timed fuses were set for 90 minutes. The British had calculated that this would give the commandos enough time to do their jobs and get clear. But the fighting had been so intense, and the evacuation such a mess, that many were still in the area when the clock ran out. At 4:30 a.m, the dock at St. Nazaire was a scene of chaotic mopping-up operations. German soldiers were securing their positions, officers were shouting orders, and the engineers on the Campbelltown were taking notes. Then, at 4:31 a.m, the world ended. A low, gut-wrenching rumble was the only warning, a deep vibration that shook the very foundations of the port. Then, the Campbelltown detonated. The explosion was not just big, it was cataclysmic. The 4 tons of high explosive, contained within the ship's hull, created a blast wave of unimaginable force. The Campbelltown itself simply ceased to exist, vaporized in a fraction of a second. The massive steel gates of the Normandie Dock, which had withstood the initial impact, were blown apart, ripped from their foundations and sent hundreds of feet into the air. The German engineers and over 300 German soldiers who were on or near the dock were killed instantly. A huge column of water, mud and metal was thrown a mile into the sky, and a tidal wave of water surged through the dock, swamping smaller vessels and drowning men in the wreckage. The blast was so powerful that it was felt in towns miles away. It was, and remains, the largest non-nuclear explosion of the Second World War. So, was it worth it? Did this incredible act of destruction and sacrifice achieve its strategic goal? The answer is an unequivocal yes. The Normandie Dock was utterly destroyed. The damage was so severe that it was never repaired. It remained out of action for the rest of the war, a rusting, shattered monument to British audacity. With the only dry dock in Europe capable of repairing her gone, the Tirpitz was trapped in Norway. She could never risk sailing into the Atlantic, because if she was damaged, she had no place to go. The threat to the Arctic convoys was neutralised. The strategic puzzle that had plagued the British Admiralty for 2 years was solved by one rusty old destroyer packed with explosives. The raid on St. Nazaire became a legend. It was a perfect example of a surgical strike achieving a strategic objective that a fleet of battleships or 1,000 bombers could not. The men who came back were hailed as heroes. The British government, recognising the incredible bravery and the high cost of the raid, awarded a staggering number of medals. 5 Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest award for valour, were awarded to participants of Operation Chariot, more than for any other single action in the war. Dozens of other medals for gallantry were also awarded, but for the men who survived, the medals were a cold comfort for the friends they had left behind in the burning, bloody docks of St. Nazaire. They had done the impossible. They had sailed a bomb into the heart of the enemy fortress and changed the course of the naval war in the Atlantic. But they paid for it in blood, a price that is remembered alongside their incredible victory.